For 3 generations, nobody in Cascade County questioned the fish lagoon behind the old dairy barn on the Torres place. 2.5 acres of still, dark water rimmed with reeds, sitting quiet at the edge of the property since before anyone could remember it not being there, stocked with bass and catfish that seemed to thrive no matter the season. Every rancher for 20 miles agreed on one unspoken rule: you leave a good lagoon alone. So when 64-year-old Ezra Torres rolled a rented backhoe down his dirt drive and told his neighbor he planned to drain it completely, the neighbor didn't hide his laughter. Word spread through the valley in days. Men who hadn't exchanged more than a nod with Ezra in a decade suddenly had strong opinions. At the grain co-op, at the diner off Highway 20, in truck cabs parked at the crossroads, one question kept circulating. Had old Ezra finally slipped? Ezra didn't answer any of it. He kept the machine running. 3 weeks into the draining, with the water lines sinking by inches daily, something began pushing up out of the exposed silt. Nobody could say what it was. Ezra wasn't offering explanations. He just kept working, steady as always, while the whole valley speculated about what he'd found in that water that 3 generations had walked past without ever seeing. What did he know that the rest of them didn't? If you've ever been mocked for trusting your own eyes over everyone else's doubt, hit subscribe and drop a like before we continue. Let us know where you're watching from. Now here's what happened. When one rancher tuned out the noise and followed his gut, Ezra Torres wasn't a man who raised his voice to make a point. Across 64 years, he'd built his whole reputation on the opposite instinct. He watched, he waited, and when he did speak, people tended to go quiet and listen. He'd worked the same 140 acres his entire adult life, ground his grandfather Solomon had cleared by mule and hand axe back in the 1930s. And in all those years, Ezra lived by one habit: never touch a thing until you understand why it's there. For almost 9 years, he'd been quietly studying that lagoon. Folks assumed he just liked casting a line off the bank in the evenings, hauling in fish that never seemed to thin out no matter how many he pulled. In truth, Ezra had been logging things that didn't add up. The water rose and fell on a rhythm that had nothing to do with the weather. During a scorching August, when every other stock pond in the county dropped 2 feet, his barely flinched. During a wet spring, when the drainage ditches ran over, his lagoon emptied itself almost as fast as it filled. He kept a small ledger in his coat pocket: dates, water levels, and a strange note about the frost-resistant patch of grass on the northeast bank that stayed green longer than it had any right to. He never spoke his suspicion out loud. He wasn't even certain of it himself. But a theory had been quietly taking shape in him for 9 years running. The trouble started the day he announced the drain. "You're murdering a perfectly healthy fishery," said his neighbor, Hollis Doyle, who'd farmed the next section over since they were boys together in grade school. "Come July drought, you're going to be begging for that water back." Down at the diner, men who barely knew Ezra acted like he'd personally betrayed them. One said he was robbing the grandkids of the best fishing hole left in the hollow. Another muttered that a man his age had no business running heavy machinery solo, with nobody around to pull him out if something went wrong. A third, half joking and half not, said Ezra had probably come unglued since losing his wife 2 winters back, and somebody ought to check in on him. That last one reached Ezra through his sister, and it cut deeper than anything else said about him, though he never brought it up to a living soul. When people mentioned it to his face, he just nodded and said, "Maybe so," and went back to the machine. The county soil conservation officer, a young transplant named Tobias Reyes, showed up unannounced to gently suggest Ezra reconsider, citing erosion concerns and the loss of a healthy aquatic habitat. Ezra poured him coffee, stood in his own driveway and heard the whole pitch out, thanked him kindly, and climbed back into the backhoe the second Tobias's truck cleared the property line. None of them knew that the previous winter, Ezra had spent long nights hauling a cardboard box down from the attic, his grandfather Solomon's old records, ledgers going back before Ezra was even born. Handwritten pages, a few brittle surveyor's sketches, a hand-drawn map, water-stained and cracking at the folds, showing the farm's original boundary lines before any lagoon existed at all. According to Solomon's notes, there had been no lagoon there in 1929. It hadn't formed on its own from rain and runoff. Someone had dug it, or something beneath the ground had carved it out slowly, patiently, the way water does when no one's paying attention. Solomon had scrawled one line in the margin of a 1956 ledger that Ezra had reread more times than he could count. "Vein still runs strong under the lower pasture. Never seal it off." Growing up, Ezra had no idea what that meant. By the time he turned 60, he had a hunch. And on a working ranch, a hunch is worth putting to the test. The draining turned out to be nothing like the simple weekend job Ezra had pictured when he first phoned the rental yard. The old outflow pipe at the lagoon's southern edge had caved in decades before and needed to be excavated by hand before the backhoe could get any traction. The machine blew a hydraulic hose on the 6th day, costing Ezra 4 lost days and a repair bill he hadn't planned for. The mud swallowed his boots, his gloves, once, and his entire leg up to the hip. He put in 12-hour stretches through an unseasonable September heatwave, alone except for his old cattle dog Ranger, who watched from the bank and barked at the stranded fish flopping in the shrinking shallows. And the whole time, trucks slowed down on the county road just to gawk. In the second week, with the water down to knee-deep and the reeds folding into the mud, the first oddity turned up. A patch of smooth, rounded gravel broke the surface near the center of the basin stone that matched nothing else naturally found on the property. Ezra dug carefully around it and uncovered more, laid out almost like a footpath running straight toward the lower pasture. He told no one. He photographed it, drove a marker stake into the ground, and kept draining. Days later came a setback that nearly finished the whole effort. An overnight storm dumped 2 inches of rain into the half-drained basin, turning the exposed mud into a churning bog. The backhoe sank to its frame and had to be dragged out by a tow truck from town, a spectacle that gave the doubters a fresh week of material. Worse, Ezra's nephew Dominic, who'd been lending a hand on weekends, started voicing real doubt. "Uncle Ezra, I mean this with love," he said one evening, staring at the wrecked, mud-choked crater where the lagoon used to sit. "But I think we ought to fill this back in before winter hits. This isn't heading anywhere good." Standing ankle-deep in ruined ground, watching the repair bills pile up while the whole valley figured he'd lost his grip, Ezra nearly agreed with him. It would have been the easy thing to do. He didn't. That night he climbed back up to the attic and read Solomon's line once more. Never seal it off. The next morning, he was back at it. Once the mud firmed enough to work again, a second discovery gave Ezra his first real spark of confidence in weeks. A run of hand-fired clay drainage tile, the kind ranchers laid by hand in the early 1900s, tracing the eastern edge of the basin in a dead straight line that appeared on no modern survey. Somebody, decades before Ezra was born, had gone to real trouble managing water in this exact spot. That wasn't how a man treated an unremarkable low patch of ground. The gravel path, once fully uncovered, led to something Dominic nearly stumbled over: a section of hand-fitted stone, laid without mortar, forming a shallow rectangular basin no wider than a kitchen table. It bore no resemblance to any farm equipment. It looked, if anything, like a forgotten hand-dug well casing, the kind built long before anyone around here had heard of a drilled bore. Word moved fast after that. By the weekend, Hollis Doyle himself came around to look, no longer laughing, just curious. Then came the discovery that changed everything. 3 days after uncovering the stone basin, Ezra noticed water still rising inside it, even with the rest of the lagoon bed bone dry under the September sun. He cleared the silt from the bottom with his bare hands and found it, a narrow crack in the bedrock, no wider than a dinner plate, with cold, clear water pushing steadily through. Not runoff, not rainwater, a living spring, exactly where Solomon's ledger said one would be, flowing once Ezra measured it properly with help from a county surveyor at nearly 40 gallons a minute, every hour of every day, drought or no drought. The lagoon had never been an ordinary stock pond at all. It had been a spring that 3 generations had walked past without understanding, quietly feeding a low spot in the land and keeping the water table under the lower pasture higher than it had any business being, in a county where wells were running dry every August. And as it turned out, keeping the water cold and oxygen-rich enough that the fish inside it had never once needed restocking. Once the county hydrogeologist confirmed what Ezra had already suspected, the math turned simple and remarkable. Properly channeled, that spring could irrigate 45 acres without a single well pump running, through any drought the region had seen in 60 years, and rebuilt right, the lagoon itself could support a proper aquaculture operation, cold, clean water flowing through it year-round. The very ground everyone assumed Ezra was throwing away was about to become the most reliable, lowest-cost piece of land in the whole valley. By the following spring, that field produced the best corn yield Ezra had seen in 10 years, watered free of charge by a source that never once slowed down, while the rebuilt lagoon held a thriving stock of trout that outgrew anything the county extension office had on record. Land prices on that side of the county crept upward as word got around. Tobias Reyes, the soil conservation officer who'd once cautioned him against the whole project, came back with a graduate researcher to study the spring's hydrology, admitting a little sheepishly that he'd been wrong to assume the lagoon was worth more left alone than whatever lay beneath it. Hollis Doyle, the first man to laugh in Ezra's driveway, was the first to ask if Ezra would walk his land with him, to see if something similar might be hiding under his own low pasture. Ezra said yes, without hesitation. He spent 2 afternoons walking Hollis's property for nothing, pointing out the same quiet signs nobody else thought to look for: the grass staying green too long, frost melting unevenly, a low corner where the cattle always bunched up in August. Within a month, they'd found a smaller spring on Hollis's land. Ezra never brought up the comment about losing his grip, and Hollis never mentioned it either. Some things don't need saying once the work has already spoken for itself. Other neighbors started showing up too, not to gawk anymore, but to ask questions. What should they watch for? What did the frost patterns actually mean? Ezra answered every one of them with the same patience he'd shown the doubters, except now people leaned in instead of laughing. 5 years later, that conversation in Ezra's driveway has turned into something of a local legend, the kind old-timers tell newcomers half as a joke and half as advice. Ezra, now 69, still walks the spring-fed field most mornings with Ranger's successor trotting at his heel, stopping by the lagoon to toss feed to fish that never once needed help surviving a drought. Most autumns he hosts a handful of younger ranchers, Dominic among them, a full believer now who manages the irrigation schedule and the lagoon stock himself, who want to learn what a worn notebook and 9 years of quiet watching can teach that no engineering report ever could. Last fall, Dominic brought his own 10-year-old daughter along. Ezra caught her crouched at the edge of the field, studying a patch of fast-growing grass, asking her father why it looked different from the rest. Ezra doesn't tell this as a story about being right. He tells it as a story about paying attention. The land had been trying to say something for 3 generations, in nothing louder than a patch of grass that wouldn't stop growing. It just took someone willing to watch quietly, take the ridicule, and dig anyway, to finally hear it. Most of what people call luck, Ezra says, is really just 9 years of staring at the same patch of ground until it finally tells you what it's been trying to say all along. If this story reminded you that patience is its own kind of skill, subscribe and tap the like button before you go. Tell us in the comments about a time you trusted your own read on something over everyone else's opinion. We'll see you in the next one.